Thank you. My name is Ofer Shinar. I've been co-managing the governance group with my friends who are sitting here, Professor Muhammad Irikat and Advocate Tamar Laster. It's going to be very hard for me to talk after Huda because I think I can only speak as a human being. I'm deeply moved by what you've done here, which I think is very respectful. And we always have to remember how fortunate we are that we have a voice as individuals, but so many others do not have a voice with regard to this conflict. I would also want to share your sentiment about the importance of psychology. And this is something we talked about a lot. And we found that the psychology of the conflict is a very important starting point for our discussions. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an intractable conflict. Intractable conflicts are defined as being total in nature, violent, and a zero-sum, perceived as irreconcilable by the members of the societies involved in the conflict, lasting at least a generation, involving all members of society, and requiring great investment from the majority of society members on a personal level. Intractable conflicts are perceived by the overwhelming majority of members of society as resulting from contradictory goals and interests, which are considered essential for society's survival. So when we started thinking about governance, the opportunities and international experience is so overwhelming that we began where we are at right now, which is what I think already been discussed at length, the deep levels of anxiety, of mistrust, the violence that we see right now erupting. All these issues are extremely, hugely challenging for all of us, I think especially for joint governance. Just think about how people are going to rule this very problematic area together. So societies involved in intractable conflict gradually develop a psychological, socio-psychological infrastructure that includes ethos of the conflict and collective emotional orientation. Societies locked in such conflicts also develop a collective memory regarding the past, which is not representative of the actual facts, but rather of how they perceived the facts. For example, I would like to stress that both sides feel that they are the ultimate victims of the conflict, which is a complete mirror image. Obviously, it cannot be that both sides are helpless victims and that the other is the oppressor. Somebody has to be the oppressor, but perhaps they are both right that this is an authentic feeling. They do feel it. It's authentic, and we have to address it. And this project is highly problematic because when we talk about joining, the problem is where we start. And we start from the identities of both sides, which were created through a very prolonged and intractable conflict, meaning that both sides have to develop a different national identity before we can have joint mechanisms of governance. We cannot aim to have joint governance unless we transform each of the societies that are currently in place, because again, Palestinians view themselves as helpless, as being oppressed by Israelis, and Israelis exactly the same. So how can you move on and try to promote processes of joint governance given those very, very problematic social and national narratives? So what we try to start with is 3 leading principles. First one is both societies will need to foster and reconstruct separate social identities in order to move away from the legacy of the conflict. Therefore, both state governance and nation building are keys to ensuring a successful resolution of the conflict. Within the context of joint governance, solutions relying on two separate states are preferable over arrangements relying on a single national unit. For this reason, confederative solutions are to be regarded as better than federations. The other point of departure for us is joint governance institutions must be gradually developed. So what we describe is basically an open-ended process. We don't know what would be the final result. We are not aiming to describe what would happen in 50 years' time. We do want to focus on where we are at right now, which is extremely problematic. And we want to move very gradually what will be the immediate next step, what would be the step tomorrow, rather than what would be the step in 10 years' time, which we don't know. I think there are too many problems here, and we are not attempting to think about the long and deep in the future aspects of what we are trying to do here. So the second issue is gradual development. And we thought about limited ad hoc joint institutions as the point of departure, because basically you can expand on those arrangements later on. And the other thing is what we have already discussed. We need to transform socio-psychological underlying structures, which are we need to give them up in order to allow for joint governance to be fully transforming the conflict into stable peace. So to just summarize this point, what we came up with is a thin confederation as a point of departure. We talk about very limited joint governance, which would not stay like that, but would develop gradually, and this is exactly what I want to convey right now, the process, how do we see the immediate future, and where are we aiming at? So the first stage is for the two states to establish limited cooperation through executive commissions granted with decision-making powers in selected fields, comprised of representatives selected by each government. These commissions will function alongside joint coordination mechanisms, collaborative forums, and dispute resolution mechanisms. This is the first immediate future for joint governance. But the second stage is after establishing trust between the parties, the two states could gradually develop thicker confederative structures. For example, parliamentary bodies and voting rights directly to the region's citizens, and the problems local citizenship and residency was already discussed at length here. And the other issue, deep into the future, we think about regional options of cooperation, and in our discussions we have thought about the problem of having a confederation or even a federation of two entities. The world has shown us that this is an unstable process, unstable solution, and it's going to be also very difficult for Palestine and Israel to remain as a confederation or something like that, which has only two entities, two national entities. Therefore, what we perceive is something which is perhaps more Middle Eastern, something along the lines of the EU, which will help us in the long term preserve stable peace. What I want also to mention is that joint governance would have three layers. The first layer is supranational institutions, which is decision-making powers will be granted for executive commissions. I already mentioned that. Coordination mechanisms will attain agreements on issues remaining under the sovereign rule of the two states. For example, education and health would be separated, but we would still need to have mechanisms allowing for cooperation on those issues that would remain under the states. The other thing we talked about is ad hoc dispute resolution forums and the establishment of a joint human rights protection mechanism, which is very important with regard to the legacy of the conflict and future problems. Another highly problematic issue is the issue of representation. If we talk about representation in joint governance, which reflects each country's population size, this would yield, unfortunately, Israeli dominance. What will we do? We thought about it long and hard, and we think that a more complex and nuanced power-sharing mechanisms are needed for each joint institution, depending on its exact authorities and operation model. In this regard, representation of local government bodies can contribute to brokering compromises. Another aspect that I would like to mention, another layer, the second layer, is national reconciliation and confidence-building measures. In this regard, transition and justice suggests that we can have truth-seeking processes, we can have vetting for civil service and military, aiming at moving away from the conflict legacy and removing those involved in conflict-related human rights violations from their public positions. Another issue is reparation schemes for individuals, for groups and communities affected by the conflict, aimed at restoring their lives, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants to reinforce the agreed ceasefire and promote long-term stability. Finally, what we have considered as perhaps our main contribution is local governance reforms, meaning we think that residency rights will become an issue of utmost importance, and consequently, local governance might become more significant to one's daily life than his national identity, which suggests that local governance is a form of decentralization and might enable us to lessen those national problems that we are fully invested in today, because we don't have that level of play between national identity and local identity. Finally, because I know I'm running out of time, I did say I need at least an hour, you know, Dalia. I just mentioned that. Challenges and dilemmas, just a few of the issues that are going to be extremely problematic. The issue of power relations, the legacy of asymmetrical power relations. Another issue which is extremely burning issue here today in Israel is Israel's degree of commitment to core democratic principles. Unfortunately, democracy is now being seen as a villain and something we have to get rid of among many Israelis. One of them is our prime minister. And finally, the issue of settlements, which we find extremely problematic, although we realize that we may, this is where this group is going, which is not to evacuate all the settlements. Still, the issue of compensation, for example, for the use of the land, prolonged use of the land of Palestinian occupied territories has created severe problems. How do you negate that? Thank you so much.